I made a video a few months ago basically arguing that we should probably understand intelligence as your ability to achieve meaningful life satisfaction, positive life outcomes. And my thinking in that video was largely influenced by, first of all, this book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are by Frans de Waal, which basically he's making the argument here that in terms of investigating animal intelligence, instead of trying to see what human-like things animals can do, we should be investigating how creative they are, how flexible and adaptable in terms of adapting to their own challenges in their own ecosystem. And then the other thing is, so if you have watched this channel for any length of time, you know that I will not shut up about this book, Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. You've also probably figured out that I am a big admirer of Taleb. I also relate to him a lot. And he wrote an article called IQ is Largely a Pseudoscientific Swindle, which got a lot of opposition from people on the right. And if you've been following this channel, you know that I've been really trying to understand right-wing thought since reading Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions, Vision of the Anointed, and realizing how helpful that was for me, see if I can get anything else out of it. And so I've been running across this, that a lot of people across the political right, especially what you might call the new right, really, really hate Taleb based on this one article and sort of have a vendetta against him. And as a fan of Taleb, first of all, I'm inclined to defend him. Second of all, I feel like in this article, he was often missing the point in terms of how people use IQ, both for good and for ill. But also, I felt like the people responding to him were both missing the point and often completely losing the plot. And one of the points that he makes is that once you get above, like, basically average IQ, IQ doesn't actually really correlate with life success. And you have graphs trying to prove it, but they're really too noisy to make that prediction. And I mentioned in my last video, and I pulled this book because I can't find Mismeasure of Man, so pretend this is Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. It's a different book by Gould. And I talked about in my last video, so one of the things that Gould talked about is when Binet, Alfred Binet, I think his name was, developed the first IQ test, he was trying to identify people who were intellectually impaired to help them catch up. And he wasn't thinking about it as a measure of how you might be smarter than average, more advanced than average, although it later obviously got used that way. And I'm like, well, that criticism seems to align with how IQ tests were originally developed. And I got some comments in that video back when I was reading comments reliably, complaining about some academic malpractice Gould did in this book, which I looked into, and it seems like he might have. So I am going to do a video at some point talking about IQ tests, because they are, again, they're reasonably valid for how they get used in Western cultures, which is as a rough proxy for how we understand intelligence. But I am also both well aware that they don't apply cross-culturally, and I am someone who breaks IQ tests in at least 3 different well-documented ways, so I can make that argument while also talking about don't necessarily take IQ as gospel the way that a lot of people seem to be doing. It's a rough approximation of a real thing, not a definitive determinant in itself. And so, anyways, so I have been thinking about this again, though, because first of all, I keep talking about, as I've been digging into right-wing thought, Nick Land, one of the pioneers of neo-reaction. This is a collection of posts of his blog Xenosystems, and the ones that I find most interesting are his cybernetics-related posts, so he was originally like an early pioneer in sort of formal cybernetics. And one of the things that I talked about in my last video is that he defined intelligence as basically extropy, negative entropy in systems that create that, which is a very broad definition. I feel like it's a useful concept. I wouldn't use intelligence for it, but it got me thinking about, you know, the way I was interpreting de Waal, which is probably oversimplifying him a bit, and the way that Taleb was assuming that IQ should correlate with life success, both of these are sort of weird metrics. Like, we all generally understand what we mean when we say someone is intelligent. We might disagree on whether a specific person is intelligent or how intelligent they are, but we all have a sense of what it is, and roughly we could probably try to approximate, but it is something that is hard to define, and you don't want to let the definition rule you once you have that. Definitions are a tool for communicating what we understand, how we understand, as opposed to generally they should not be like a hard metric that we're evaluating stuff against. But anyways, I have been thinking about this because I actually don't think anymore that we really should be assuming that intelligence should correlate with life success, or at least that high intelligence should, for at least 2 reasons. The first of these being, I've had conversations with at least 3 highly gifted people in the last few months who have basically said the same thing, which is, Giftedness should probably be considered a disability, but that's sort of socially unacceptable to say in our modern culture. But it is, because if you are too gifted, people can't understand you. And I talk about Idries Shah a lot, but there's a lot of examples of this. So people can't understand what you're saying, and they will reduce it to what they can understand and either see you as incoherent or idiotic or insane. And so I have actually a short coming out in a week or so, Double Empathy Problem in Autism. But the short of the short is that autistic people are supposed to have cognitive empathy defects, difficulty understanding other minds, but it's not clear to me if that's actually the case or it's that we have trouble understanding non-autistic minds, while non-autistic people are not expected to understand us because that's the default. But giftedness itself has that same sort of double empathy problem, which can produce autistic-like traits to the point that you even wonder, like, is autism in highly gifted people, is it the same thing as autism? I mean, there's different kinds of autism. But anyway, so that's one argument against assuming that you should actually have a correlation above average intelligence, giftedness with life success, is that to the extent that people can't understand the highly gifted, and we are a pretty small minority, you may have both sort of people just, I don't get you, I don't know what to do with you, or active aversion, or even designing systems against you. And I think all of these things are in play. And I'm going to talk about these in future videos. But so you shouldn't necessarily assume that intelligence correlates with life success just because if you're too far outside the norm, like most successful people should be those who are just slightly more intelligent than average, but still able to communicate their thoughts, see what the average person doesn't, but in a way that when you explain it, they're like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and I get that. And then the other thing is that these evaluations and metrics of life success tend to be focused on easily quantifiable things like income, for example, which people who are smart enough, I think, learn not to mistake the means for the end. And so people who are a little smarter than average, I think, are really good at pursuing money and status, but not good at figuring out when to stop. And then people who are smarter are often a lot better at figuring out when to stop. When I talked about this book, Distinct Alien Race, The Untold Story of Franco-Americans by David Vermette, I talked about how, so my father's side of the family is French-Canadian. And one of the things that Vermette talks about is that French-Canadians have tended to culturally be relatively unambitious. And I saw this with both my grandfather and my father. My grandfather ran a small business and then decided it was easier to just get a 9-to-5 job, which he did at Bath Iron Works for the rest of his life. And my father straight up ruled out any sort of entrepreneurship thing. And I was frustrated by that on a number of levels, including my mother told me about how she was on the board of directors for Cooley Dickinson Hospital in Northampton. And so she knew that medical record software was awful. And she was trying to get him to hey, people in computing. I know these medical people. We could put together a plan, business proposal, get them to pay to build better medical record software, and you could then get it built. My father he did not like that idea, and it could be, I don't know where my parents' relationship was at that point, but it also was, my father was very, as long as he sort of could live the life for him that was fulfilling, he didn't need any more. And for me, I have a brief phase where if you look at my history of videos on this channel, you'll see that I suddenly get very interested in how to make as much money as I can without violating my own sense of ethics too much. Because I was sort of thinking about it in terms of the way the world works, this might be the only way to sort of pursue the kind of life I want to live. And one of the things that got me there was, so in this book, The 10X Rule by Grant Cardone, he argues basically that most people underestimate the effort involved in small things and overestimate the effort involved in big things, to the extent that basically doing 10 times better is going to take the same amount of effort while having obviously 10 times better payoff. And so you should be simultaneously setting your goal higher, but also estimating how much effort things are actually going to take. And so I was focused on, I was sort of setting my freedom number financially at a relatively high, basically the point I would not have to worry about money again. And that was what I was aiming for. And I was like, if I'm setting my goals in terms of money, I should be following Grant Cardone's advice and maybe aiming 10 times higher. And so I had a brief period in this channel where I was thinking about this in terms of, I guess I should be trying to figure out how to make as much money as I can without feeling like I'm selling my soul, violating my ethics. But then what I realized is trying to do that is itself a lot of effort. for which I have relatively low motivation because I'm pursuing an instrumental goal as opposed to an inherent goal. And so what I realized is qualitatively, it is going to be a lot harder for me as someone who is quite weird to be successful professionally as an independent creative. But trying to figure out how to make money in a way that doesn't sort of compromise my ethics and soul, at least like a lot of money, is a tricky needle to thread, and it's hard to be motivated. Whereas I think I can actually aim higher to being successful creatively as someone who is too weird to be accessible, because I'm sufficiently creative that I could probably figure out how to make a living for it. If I'm pursuing money just as a means of trying to get to living the kind of life I want to anyways, why not try to figure out how to make enough money to support myself and a potential future family on an income where I am doing stuff that gives me a reason to get up in the morning? And that is, in a sense, a harder goal, although it's qualitatively harder, not quantitatively. And so if I succeed in that, and you were to look at me, you would be like, okay, yeah, you have a reasonably affluent life, but you're not rich. Whereas someone else who wasn't thinking about it this way might end up doing like Grant Cardone advised, and they go make $100 billion, right? And so I think those are sort of two reasons that you shouldn't necessarily expect intelligence to correlate with life success. Again, that when you're a minority and you're too inaccessible to people, then it's kind of a disability, even though it's not a tactful thing to say. And then, even if you are achieving success, if you are not mistaking the means for the end, and so many people tend to mistake the means for the end, you're going to look less successful than the people who mistake the means for the end, but are best at achieving them. And so anyways, I wanted to talk about that quickly. I will have another video at some point on how I think I would define intelligence, because again, it's something we all know it when we see it, but it's hard to clearly define in a way that doesn't immediately start to fall apart. And I will probably sooner I'll have a video on IQ as well. And before I go, I have two quick announcements. And so one of them is, so the book club for Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, that will be August 29th at 2 p.m., because that sort of overwhelmingly won. And the other thing is, so tomorrow, assuming this video comes out when I plan, I will be doing a live stream at 9 a.m. So tomorrow is the 15th, August 15th. And I'll probably be going forward doing at least monthly live streams because I've had a good time so far, at least until I start to look like I could become a successful streamer, and then I'll probably hate it and stop. But for the moment, it's a small, intimate thing. I like talking with the people there, so I'll be doing that. So I will, for the book club, I will make a new Discord server. I have my paid Ko-Fi supporter only Discord server, but I'm going to make a new one that I'm going to basically lock down when the book club isn't happening, so I don't have to moderate it, and then I will open it up, and I will have that in the video descriptions at least a week before the book club happens. But I have to set that up. So anyways, I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Oh, and also, as much as I admire Nassim Nicholas Taleb, one thing that I don't want to emulate is how much time he spends arguing with people on Twitter. But right now, I couldn't do that because I got my Twitter account suspended for making a joke so bad that apparently their AI bot determined, after careful review, that it was definitely 100% spam, which the joke was, if you've heard, all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. My joke was, if all you have is a hamburglar, everything looks like a meal, which is the kind of weird autistic by association thing that I will probably talk about in future videos. Anyways, thanks for watching.